Welcome back. I'm Paul Mamelo, and we've been talking with Brendan Boyle. He's the Pennsylvania State Representative for the 170th
That's
District.
right.
And you started to tell us a little bit about a specific piece of legislation that you worked on that ended up passing unanimously, and that had to do with survivors' benefits for first responders. Can you give us a little bit more information about that bill?
So essentially, this targets police, firefighters, or any other sort of emergency responders or first responders. So before this became law, this past year, the way it worked in Pennsylvania was, say, Borough of Rockledge or somewhere in western PA, the local police would negotiate for their survivor's benefit. And by survivor's benefit, I mean the payment that the surviving spouse and family would receive if that police officer or firefighter were killed in the line of duty.
So it was a locally negotiated contract?
Totally. There was no one statewide standard.
Huh.
So in Philadelphia, it was a partial benefit, about 50%. Some local boroughs or townships, nothing at all. And it was something that was negotiated at each contract. And in a number of boroughs where we have volunteer firefighters, obviously there's no such thing as a survivor's benefit. So, and we've seen too often, both in Philadelphia but also statewide, we've lost too many police officers over the last few years who were killed in the line of duty, so this has become more of a relevant issue over the last few years than, say, it was a decade ago, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So the way my bill works, which fortunately is now law, is that any police officer or firefighter or emergency personnel who's killed in the line of duty, their family, surviving spouse and family, now receives a full survivor's benefit. It's one statewide standard. It's a full survivor's benefit. It is the least that we can do as a society to ensure that the families of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for us in society, that those families are taken care of. And the good news is, the state population is about 12.5 million people. In the course of 10 years, we'll be talking about maybe a dozen families. So the cost to each of us as a taxpayer is incredibly small, but the contribution that makes to those families is enormous.
Absolutely. And, for those who give their life in the public service like that.
Exactly right.
So, you talked a little bit about how even a bill like that, which passes unanimously in the end, has opposition while it works its way through the process.
That's right.
What type of opposition could people have to a bill like that?
That was the question that I was asking for about the 10 months it took me to get it passed. But, some people wanted different language. Some folks like the idea of having, their name somewhere a part of it. Some, want to attach some language about a different issue as part of it. So you have to, either welcome that or be wary of it, depending on what that does. And then also part of it was, and if you remember in the summer of 2009, we had that very protracted long budget delay.
Right.
So a number of other good pieces of legislation, such as mine, were held up for months just because everyone was focused on the budget impasse.
Well, along those lines, then, budget-wise, does this bill call for it to come out of the state budget?
It does. It entirely comes out of the state budget, so it actually relieves it helps local townships and boroughs and even big cities that have financial problems. But again, although there is a fiscal impact to the state, it is incredibly small. So far, unfortunately, we've had one family that's had to take advantage of this. Police officer was killed in Pittsburgh back in December of 2009, and his widow is now the first and so far only family to receive this full survivor's benefit as part of my bill.
Oh, okay. So, right. Obviously, we'll hope that
as
bill
few
doesn't have to.
Right. Hope it's rarely necessary.
Now, in looking over the legislation that you've sponsored and supported in your first year as a legislator, I see that a lot of them are targeting crime and police-oriented to help us with law enforcement.
That's right.
And things like that. Do you have a background in that sort of led you in that direction?
Well, I guess there are a couple things. First is criminal justice is a policy area I've always been very interested in. It was a part of my graduate study. But then in addition to that, representing neighborhoods of Northeast Philadelphia where so many Philadelphia police officers live, it does make me probably more in tune to those sorts of issues than maybe a representative from elsewhere.
Well, let's talk about some specific legislation that you've worked on. You had a bill that would eliminate parole for repeat violent offenders. Is that like a 3 strikes rule kind of thing?
It's somewhat similar to that, but essentially, to take a step back, I wanted to focus on repeat violent offenders. These are the worst of the worst. Because if you take a look at the recent murders that, say, happened in the city of Philadelphia, or even statewide, the vast majority were perpetrated by these repeat violent offenders. A relatively small percentage of our prison population, approximately 1%, fit that definition. Yet that 1% worst of the worst are responsible for the majority of violent crime we've seen over the last few years. So my approach to it was, a lot of people call for let's get tough. Let's be tough and smart. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. If the parole system is working for nonviolent or first-time offenders, then let's not touch that. The fact is that of those who received parole in 2007, 95% haven't been rearrested. For them, the system is working, and for society. But for these repeat violent offenders, clearly the system is breaking down, and we're not adequately dealing with them. So my bill specifically targeted that worst of the worst, that most violent 1%, who fit the classification of a repeat violent offender. It would eliminate parole for them. It would impanel, it would create a different sentencing standard that would empower a judge to impose greater sentences. And really, it would bring Pennsylvania up to speed to how the law exists in other states that are much tougher and more targeted on those repeat violent offenders. If you think about it, this bill that I proposed and that has passed the House Judiciary Committee, it's not a sledgehammer, it's a scalpel. It's going to specifically where the problem lies.
I noticed one other, you mentioned minimum penalties. I saw your name associated with a minimum penalty for rapists and rape offenders.
Right.
Can you just briefly tell us?
Well, that would be part of it as well. I've also been active on the domestic violence front, and that's related to the minimum penalty bill that I have. Essentially, in my view, domestic violence is a quiet crisis in our society. It just does not get the sort of attention that it should in Pennsylvania. Right now, out of every 4 days in Pennsylvania, a woman is murdered as a result of domestic violence. We need to do more to raise awareness of this issue, and we also need to do more on the criminal justice front once we have those who have perpetrated domestic violence. It is a very difficult kind of crime to deal with and very different than most of the other crimes that our police are faced with.
Right, and I know you have a very specific bill that focuses on that I want to get into detail about, but we have to take a short break, and we'll be right back after that.